Hey guys! Tonight we drift into a world where size, shine, and umbrellas mattered just as much as ideology. You picture yourself standing on a wet cobblestone street in post-war Moscow. The rain falls in steady sheets, misting the golden glow of street lamps. And you hear the slow, dignified rumble of a Soviet limousine. Its black paint looks glossy and heavy, catching every bead of water like a mirror of the gray sky. You can almost feel the damp chill through your coat as the long vehicle glides past. Wipers squeaking, its presence less about transportation and more about theater. These were cars designed not simply to move people, but to declare power in a language everyone could understand, even when half the population didn't have shoes that fit. And here's your reality check. If you weren't one of the select few riding in the backseat, you were definitely the one standing in the rain. And you probably wouldn't survive this game of appearances. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're watching from, and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along Red Square in your imagination, watching puddles form between the ancient stones. The Kremlin towers loom above, their green rooftops glistening. Out of the drizzle comes the deep growl of an engine, slower and heavier than the little Moskvich cars buzzing around the city. This is no ordinary vehicle. It's the limousine of the party elite. Soldiers stand straighter as it approaches. Bystanders crane their necks. And suddenly the rain seems less noticeable, almost respectful, bouncing harmlessly off the shiny roof. Here's the first oddity you'll learn. In the late 1940s, when Soviet citizens were still recovering from war and ration cards, the state funneled resources into making these massive cars. The ZIS 110, for example, was nearly 6 meters long. Historians still argue whether this was a necessary act of symbolism for a rising superpower or just Stalin's personal vanity project. Either way, the average person could never dream of owning one. To put it in perspective, most Soviet families were still lining up for bread while a lucky few were driven around in rolling fortresses with chrome bumpers wide enough to seat a child. You follow one down a side street. The rain hasn't let up. It rarely does during Moscow's long damp seasons. The chauffeur, disciplined as a soldier, stares straight ahead through a windshield fogging despite the constant swish-swish of the wipers. In the backseat, curtains are drawn, but you can imagine some official staring blankly out at the water-streaked city. Dry as parchment and twice as unapproachable, Soviet limousines weren't just cars. They were stages on wheels, with each drop of rain amplifying the drama. There's a kind of irony in it, isn't there? These limos were meant to symbolize invulnerability, yet they constantly battled the elements. Rain seeped into leather, mud spattered white walls, and Moscow's infamous potholes shook passengers despite all the engineering. The joke at the time was that these limos looked invincible until they had to drive anywhere outside the city, where even goats hesitated to tread. And yet, you keep watching. The parade routes glisten with water, but the limousine doesn't falter. You hear whispers from the crowd. Maybe Stalin himself is inside. Maybe it's just another minister. The uncertainty was part of the mystique. To the soaked citizens standing along the curb, every limousine represented the state itself. Powerful, untouchable, moving at its own pace. The rain continues. Your shoes squelch as you shift your weight. Somewhere nearby, a vendor sells roasted seeds under a flimsy tarp, and the smell mixes with damp asphalt. The limousine pulls away, leaving only rippling puddles in its wake. You exhale, half amused, half weary. The Soviet Union might have been built on ideology, but in weather like this, It was also built on the simple art of looking important while staying dry. And here's one quirky tidbit for you. Umbrellas were often carried not by leaders themselves but by aides jogging awkwardly beside the car until the door opened. It was theater, pure and simple, a choreography of dryness in a world of drizzle. You can't help but smirk. Imagine your whole job being umbrella sprinter, trying not to trip in front of the entire Politburo. As the rain grows heavier, you realize the story of Soviet limousines isn't just about cars. It's about spectacle, hierarchy, and the illusion of comfort in a society where most people were soaked to the bone. And you, still standing there, can't escape the feeling that the rain will always fall harder on the crowd than on the men behind the tinted glass. You linger under that drizzle a little longer, tracing the lineage of these massive cars back to their origin story. When Joseph Stalin looked at the limousines ferrying American leaders in the 1930s and 40s, he didn't see mere automobiles. He saw rolling emblems of authority. And so, in classic Soviet fashion, he ordered his factories to produce something equally grand, maybe even grander, despite the fact that factories at the time were still patching up tanks, tractors, and anything that could move on four wheels. You trudge with him, metaphorically of course, into the era of the Gaz and ZIS limousines. The tale begins with Gaz, the Gorkovsky Avtomobilny Zavod, churning out solid, modest vehicles. These weren't luxurious by any stretch, but they were sturdy, reliable, and often borrowed heavily from Ford designs. Historians still argue whether this partnership with Ford in the 1930s gave Soviet engineers genuine technical expertise or if it merely turned them into skilled copycats. Either way, the Gaz lineage laid the foundation. By the time the Soviets wanted something fit for the ruling class, the Gaz plants weren't quite up to the task. That honor went to ZIS, the Zavod imeni Stalina, literally factory named after Stalin. Subtlety was never the strong suit here. Picture the ZIS 101 from 1936. One of the first serious Soviet attempts at a limousine. Long hood, upright stance, and enough chrome trim to make you squint if the sun ever managed to peek through Moscow's clouds. The rain, of course, softened the shine, but the symbolism still cut through the gloom. You walk past one idling on a wet curb, steam curling from the exhaust like the breath of some heavy animal. Inside, velvet seats and wood veneer tried to whisper luxury. But let's be honest, it was less about comfort and more about proving the USSR could match capitalist decadence. Now here's the quirky twist. These cars were enormous yet fragile in ways the propaganda posters never mentioned. Their suspensions groaned, their fuel consumption was absurd, and mechanics often had to cannibalize parts from American imports just to keep them running. Drivers joke that a ZIS could drink more fuel in a day than a soldier on leave could vodka. And the car would still complain. You imagine yourself sitting behind the wheel, rain pattering across the glass, trying to guide the beast through Moscow's tram-clogged streets. The steering wheel is bigger than a dinner plate, and your arms ache after half an hour. Yet, when the motorcade passes through Red Square, people stare not at your sweaty struggle but at the sheer bulk of the machine. For a brief moment, the soaked citizens forget their leaking roofs and thin coats. They see power made real, rolling on rubber tires. Stalin, of course, wasn't satisfied. He wanted more grandeur. Enter the ZIS 110, rolled out after the war in 1946. If you squint at photos of it, you'll notice something familiar. That's because it was, well, a near clone of the American Packard Super 8. The Soviets claimed it was inspired by global design trends. Everyone else just said, yep, that's a Packard with a hammer and sickle accent. But when you see one parked in the drizzle, its broad grille glistening with raindrops, The effect is undeniable. This was a car meant to intimidate, to reassure, and to carry men who believed themselves untouchable. Yet historians still argue whether copying the Packard was a stroke of pragmatic genius. Why reinvent the wheel? Or an embarrassing admission that Soviet luxury engineering had limits. The debate continues. But in the rain-slicked streets of Moscow, nobody argued. The ZIS 110 looked the part. And in politics, appearances are half the battle. Think about the irony here. While these giant limos rolled out of factories, many workers didn't have proper housing. They trudged home through mud, dripping wet, only to see in newspapers the glossy silhouettes of limos parading officials past cheering crowds. If resentment bubbled, it was drowned out by state-controlled radio praising Soviet industry's triumphs. You can almost hear the static crackle, the announcer's voice booming about progress, while your boots still squish in puddles. And here's a fringe tidbit to keep you smiling sleepily. The very first prototypes of these limos had a peculiar problem with door seals. In heavy rain, water sometimes seeped inside, pooling on the luxurious carpets meant for the most important men in the Union. Imagine Stalin stepping out with wet socks. Probably not the safest scenario for the engineer responsible. So, as you follow this lineage from humble Gaz to the commanding ZIS, you notice how rain always framed the story. It blurred the chrome, tested the engineering, and reminded everyone that no matter how much power sat behind tinted glass, the weather never really cared. You, standing there again, let the drizzle bead on your eyelashes, and realize, these limousines weren't just about mobility. They were about making Moscow look impressive. Even when soaked to the bone, you're still standing in that endless drizzle, watching another convoy creep through the slick streets. When it finally clicks, these limousines weren't just cars. They were props, rolling, glittering chunks of theater designed to make the crowd feel awe. Even if the crowd was dripping wet and miserable, you notice the sheen of chrome that stretches across the grille like a row of soldiers' teeth, polished to a shine that almost seems comical under the rain clouds. Chrome wasn't just decoration in the Soviet world. It was a statement. If the West could dazzle with Cadillacs and Packards, the Soviets would blind you with their own version of luxury. Even if shortages meant a factory down the road was still struggling to produce door handles for regular cars. The ZIS 110, the one you already trailed in your imagination, was particularly heavy on chrome. Every curve, every edge, reflected puddles like a mirror. And yet, in a way, the rain made the whole thing more dramatic. Droplets streaked across the metal like tears on a mask. You walk closer, half expecting the car to hiss or growl at you. Instead, the engine hums with low menace, a sound carefully tuned to be noticeable but not flashy. Historians still argue whether the deliberate overuse of chrome and oversized dimensions was meant to mimic Western luxury or to exaggerate it into something uniquely Soviet. Some say it was intimidation. Others say it was desperation dressed as style. Here's the mainstream fact. Official ceremonies in the Soviet Union always used these limousines as symbols of state strength. From May Day parades to solemn funerals, the long black cars appeared like ritual objects, as much a part of the performance as flags and marching soldiers. Foreign dignitaries were ferried in them, and photographs of these cars circulated internationally, subtly declaring, yes, we too can look important in the rain. And then the quirky tidbit. The chrome wasn't just for show. Mechanics claimed that in the gloom of Soviet winters, with their short daylight hours, the shiny grills and bumpers made limos easier to spot in convoys. Almost like reflective safety gear for political elites. Imagine that. A 6-meter-long hulk of steel relying on blinding chrome just to avoid bumping into its escort. You find yourself trailing a convoy down a boulevard slick with water. Each car is spaced with military precision. Headlights hazy behind mist. You notice how the reflections of neon signs, rare splashes of color in gray Moscow, bend and warp across the chrome surfaces. It feels unreal, like watching moving mirrors glide past, each carrying invisible passengers who only mattered because they were inside rather than outside. Like you, the soundscape is unforgettable. Rain tapping roofs, tires hissing over wet asphalt, and that low, steady rumble of engines engineered not for speed but for presence. The cars move deliberately slow, not because they can't go faster but because importance requires time. The longer people wait in the rain, the more majestic the sight becomes. At least, that was the theory. But you can't help noticing the irony. Chrome is fickle under rain. It spots. It dulls. It requires endless polishing. Somewhere, a low-ranking worker's entire job was buffing these limousines until they gleamed like trophies, only for a sudden shower to undo the work in minutes. You smirk at the thought. The Soviet Union, champion of the worker, devoting hours of labor to ensure chrome sparkled just long enough to impress onlookers. And here's where the scholarly debate sneaks back in. Some historians argue that Soviet leaders didn't even care about the limos themselves. What mattered was the effect they produced. This aura of modernity, authority, and untouchability. Others counter that the leaders were obsessed with the cars, genuinely enjoying their grandeur as personal luxuries. Whichever is true, you, the eternal bystander in the drizzle, can see how well the illusion worked. Picture this. A May Day parade. The air damp and heavy with drizzle. Soldiers march in perfect lines. Tanks clatter across wet stones. And then, gliding at a stately pace, comes the limousine, chrome flashing even under the dull clouds. Crowds murmur, umbrellas tilt, and every camera flash catches the reflection. The car doesn't just carry a leader. It carries the idea that leadership itself is above the weather. You tug your coat tighter around your shoulders, the damp seeping into your sleeves. And you wonder if anyone watching truly believed it. Probably. In a world where most people were used to patched up clothes and leaky roofs. The sheer absurdity of so much shine felt like proof that the system had power to spare. Chrome, in the end, was propaganda on wheels. And maybe that's the real joke here. The chrome never kept anyone dry. The people in the backseats were dry because they were in the car, not because it sparkled. Still, as another limousine glides past you with rain streaming down its sides, you can't help admitting, it does look impressive, even if the only one still soaked through is you. You linger on the sidewalk, rain dripping from your collar, when another convoy passes, this time moving slower, deliberately, as if the weather itself is part of the act. The Soviet Union had a strange relationship with rain. It never stopped the show. It simply became another prop. You notice how chauffeurs, dressed in pressed uniforms already soaking through, keep perfect formation despite the sheets of water splattering across their windshields. Their job wasn't only to drive. It was to make sure the convoy looked untouchable, even while half the drivers were blinking through misted glass and praying the wipers didn't fail. Rainproofing, if you could call it that, became a quiet obsession. Some of the early ZIS models had notoriously weak seals, meaning that water dripped into the interior during storms, not exactly ideal when you're carrying the general secretary. Engineers scrambled to improve the design, adding thicker door rubbers, better window trims, and dual-speed wipers. But here's the thing, you still had Moscow weather, which meant that no matter how carefully you designed a car, the rain found a way inside. Historians still argue whether the failure to truly rainproof these convoys reflected the limits of Soviet engineering or simply the reality of 1940s and 50s automotive tech. The mainstream fact: convoys during important ceremonies almost always involved multiple limousines, police escorts, and even ZIL or gas support vehicles loaded with mechanics. If a limo broke down or started leaking, the entire convoy had backup plans ready to go. To the public, though, it looked seamless. Cars sliding across glistening roads, headlights glowing through drizzle, a show of precision. And the quirky tidbit: chauffeurs were often required to memorize not only driving routes but also emergency umbrella drills. Yes, umbrella drills. If a leader needed to step out mid-rain, the umbrella had to appear in less than 2 seconds, positioned exactly to keep water off the official's hat and coat. Too slow, and the chauffeur, or his assistant, risked being reassigned to Siberia. You imagine the absurdity of men in full uniform practicing opening umbrellas in front of mirrors. Also, a minister's shoes wouldn't get damp. You picture yourself squeezed into the front passenger seat of one of these limos, the smell of damp upholstery rising as water seeps from your overcoat. Outside, a motorcycle escort sprays up fans of water as it guides the convoy through puddles. The chauffeur grips the giant wheel, wipers slapping rhythmically, his eyes fixed forward. His body may be drenched, but his job is to embody composure. For him, there is no weather, no discomfort, only the illusion of control. And it worked. Citizens lined boulevards with umbrellas turned inside out by the wind, craning their necks for a glimpse of who might be inside. Sometimes the curtains were closed, hiding the occupants. Sometimes they were pulled back just enough for people to see the faint outline of a uniform or a face. The rain made it harder to tell, but that was part of the drama. Mystery blurred by mist. You can't help but laugh quietly to yourself. Soviet planners loved detail and ritual, but nature never read the script. A sudden downpour during a parade could turn polished chrome streaky and muddied roads into obstacle courses. Yet the spectacle always went on. In the eyes of the party, no amount of rain could diminish authority. You, soaked through and shivering, might disagree. Here's a moment worth remembering. The 1967 October Revolution Parade. A dreary, rain-soaked affair where Brezhnev and other officials still insisted on standing through limousine sunroofs to salute the troops. Water poured down their overcoats. Hats sagged, but the cameras rolled anyway. Historians still debate whether this stubbornness was about showing solidarity. Look, we get wet just like you. Or about refusing to let weather dictate politics. Either way, you can't shake the image of powerful men dripping on velvet seats while chauffeurs silently cursed. The lack of proper drainage. The convoy ahead of you splashes through a wide puddle, waves curling away from the heavy tires. The crowd shifts, water soaking into their boots. Yet eyes remain locked on the black cars gliding forward. In that moment, rain is no inconvenience. It's a stage light, making chrome glimmer brighter and engines rumble deeper. And you realize something strange. These limousines weren't only about shielding leaders from the elements. They were about proving that even in the most miserable weather, power rolled forward unhindered. It didn't matter if chauffeurs ended the day looking like drowned rats. What mattered was that the image stayed intact, crisp, and untouchable. You pull your coat tighter again, the dampness heavy on your shoulders, and smirk at the absurdity. Soviet rainproofing was never really about keeping the rain out. It was about keeping appearances dry. You watch another long, black limousine roll slowly through the puddled street, its wipers ticking like a tired metronome. And you can't help wondering what it actually felt like to sit inside. From the outside, these machines looked invincible, sleek, armored, dripping authority. But step through those heavy doors, and you entered a space designed as much for paranoia as for prestige. The interiors were lush by Soviet standards. Thick velvet upholstery, polished wood accents, sometimes even a little splash of faux crystal lighting. To the average worker standing ankle-deep in mud, this was unimaginable luxury. But for the men actually sitting inside, comfort was always secondary to security. You trace your fingers across an imaginary seatback and realize every detail was chosen with suspicion in mind. Curtains on the windows weren't only for shade. They kept prying eyes from guessing who was inside. Doors were deliberately heavy, sometimes armored, because you never knew who might want them forced open. And those telephones built into the armrests? They weren't for calling home to say goodnight. They were for constant contact with the KGB, even when you were just trying to look stoic during a drizzle. Here's the mainstream fact. The Soviet security services were deeply involved in limousine design. Every model from the late Stalin years through Brezhnev's era included specifications for armor, plating, hidden compartments, and communication systems. The backseat wasn't simply a seat. It was a miniature control room. Now for the quirky tidbit. Chauffeurs reported that some models had microphones hidden inside, pointed not at outsiders but at the passengers themselves. The reasoning was simple. Leaders needed protection, but they also needed monitoring. Imagine climbing into your own car knowing that every muttered complaint about the rain, every sarcastic aside about the latest speech, might end up on someone else's desk. You'd probably stop talking altogether. Or at least practice your most loyal small talk. You picture yourself sliding into one of these velvet thrones. The windows fogging as rain streaks down outside. The engine hums, muffled and constant, while the world blurs by in watery streaks. You're cushioned, yes, but you don't relax. The silence feels thick, like someone is listening. Your hands rest on the polished wood armrest, but you keep them still, not wanting to look fidgety. In a strange way, the limousine becomes a moving cage. Comfortable enough, but never quite safe. Historians still argue whether leaders like Khrushchev or Brezhnev truly enjoyed the experience of these rides. Some accounts suggest they preferred to stretch out in the backseat, relishing the comfort as proof of their status. Others insist the atmosphere inside was tense, claustrophobic, filled with cigarette smoke and the quiet hum of suspicion. Both may be true. What mattered wasn't the seat itself, but who sat in it, and whether they trusted the silence. You lean your head back against the seat in your imagination, listening to the rain hammer the roof. Outside, crowds crane their necks to catch a glimpse of who's inside, while inside, the real drama is invisible. An aide rehearsing the exact words he'll use. A minister deciding if it's safer to stay silent. A driver glancing nervously in the rearview mirror without ever making eye contact. And then there's the absurd reality. Even with all the velvet and chrome, these limousines could be terribly uncomfortable. Heating systems sometimes failed, leather cracked, suspension sagged under the added weight of armor. On long rides, backseats could feel less like thrones and more like soggy couches on wheels. Power, it turns out, doesn't always come with lumbar support. Still, when you look again from the outside, the image holds. A curtain twitches, a glimpse of a silhouette appears, and the crowd murmurs. You don't see the paranoia. You don't hear the hidden microphones. You just see importance, dry and untouchable, gliding through a storm. And you can't help but laugh softly. Because the real secret of these Soviet limousines wasn't their size or shine. It was the fact that the most powerful men in the country rode everywhere in the rain just as worried about being overheard as they were about being admired. You trail another convoy down a rain-slick boulevard, and this time the cars look eerily familiar. The rounded fenders, the stately grills, the sweep of chrome, it all feels like déjà vu. And then you remember why. The Soviets weren't shy about borrowing, sometimes outright copying. Western designs. If Packard or Cadillac built something grand, Moscow often rolled out its own version a few years later, like a damp echo across the Iron Curtain. Take the ZIS 110, the flagship limousine of Stalin's post-war era. Compare it side by side with a Packard Super 8, and you'll swear you're looking at siblings. Long noses, wide chrome grills, even the way the roofline flows into the rear fenders. Historians still argue whether Soviet engineers acquired blueprints through official channels, espionage, or simple reverse engineering. The Soviets claimed inspiration. The West muttered imitation. Either way, the resemblance was impossible to miss. Here's the mainstream fact. Packard had once been considered one of the world's most prestigious carmakers, a symbol of American elegance in the 1930s and 40s. To Soviet planners, choosing Packard as the model to emulate made sense. It was like wearing the same suit as your rival to prove you belonged in the same room. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some say Stalin himself rode in a real Packard during World War II, and afterward demanded that Soviet engineers give him something exactly like this. But ours. Imagine the design meeting. A nervous engineer sketching furiously while raindrums on the factory roof. Whispering, "Comrade, he means exactly," like down to the door handles. You can picture yourself walking around a ZIS 110 in the drizzle, running your hand along the rain-slick fender. You hear the squish of your shoes on wet asphalt, smell the tang of petrol in the damp air. At first glance, the car radiates authority, but step back, and it looks suspiciously like an American import with Cyrillic badges. The irony drips heavier than the rain. A regime that prided itself on self-sufficiency building its icons out of borrowed ideas. And yet, to the citizens watching from sidewalks, none of that mattered. They didn't care if the car was copied, inspired, or smuggled. What they saw was proof that their leaders deserved something massive and gleaming. You watch umbrellas tilt back, crowds murmuring as the convoy slides past. Nobody in the drizzle is tallying which grille design came from Detroit. They're too busy staring at the wet, glistening image of power. The scholarly debate goes further. Some argue that Soviet limos weren't just copies but deliberate exaggerations. Longer, heavier, more imposing than their Western counterparts. It wasn't enough to match America. The Soviets had to outdo them, even if that meant cars so big they barely fit Moscow's older streets. Others argue that the resemblance was less political and more practical. Why reinvent design cues that already worked? You smirk at the thought. Entire committees of Soviet engineers huddled under leaky factory ceilings, debating the width of chrome strips while the rest of the country queued for bread. And yet, that's how prestige was measured. By inches of wheelbase and kilograms of polished metal. Step inside one of these Packard-esque limos in your imagination. The interior, while plush, carries faint echoes of American style. Wide bench seats, sweeping dash lines, even the way the wood trim curves. But then you notice subtle differences. Heavier doors, thicker glass, a faint smell of machine oil mixed with damp velvet. The Soviets may have borrowed the look, but they stamped it with their own paranoia. Every design was less about pleasure, more about survival. Outside, rain patters against the roof, blurring reflections of neon signs across the polished chrome. You glance out the curtained window and realize the crowd sees only shadows, never faces. That was the whole point. It didn't matter if the car's DNA traced back to Detroit. Once it rolled through Red Square, it became Soviet theater. And here's the final irony. While the elite glided in their Packard look-alikes, ordinary citizens often rode in trams so crowded the windows fogged instantly in bad weather. To them, the limousine might as well have been from another planet. You pull your coat tighter as another convoy passes, water spraying from the wide tires. The message is clear. Importance doesn't need to be original. It just needs to look impressive in the rain. Rain again. It always seems to be raining in Moscow when someone wants to look important. You huddle under the gray drizzle, the kind that soaks into your shoulders before you realize it, and you watch as a gleaming Gaz 12 Zim pulls up in slow, stately fashion. The black paint is so polished it reflects the puddles like mirrors. Even if the fenders already carry flecks of damp grit, out steps a man in a broad coat, tugging his collar higher, the glint of metals on his chest muted by the overcast sky. He doesn't hurry. And why should he? This car has delivered him right to the front steps of the ministry. Rain is just part of the show. You can almost hear the quiet logic behind these machines. No one builds something this wide, this long, unless they want you to know the occupant matters. The Zim was the mid-century Soviet attempt to democratize importance. At least in theory. Built in the late 1940s and into the 1950s. It was the limousine for regional leaders, factory directors, and officials who weren't quite high enough to snag a ZIS but still too elevated for the boxy sedans of the masses. A sort of rolling velvet rope. And inside? Plush seats upholstered in velour that, after a few years of cigarette smoke and damp coats, started to smell like a wet theater curtain. But for its time, it was a marvel. Wide bench seating, chrome accents, a dashboard that gleamed faintly under dim lighting. You settle into the scene in your mind, resting your elbow on a padded armrest that probably squeaks if you press too hard. And you notice the quiet hum of the straight-six engine. At idle, it purrs with a low, almost apologetic sound, as though trying not to disturb the state secrets being whispered in the back seat. Historians still argue whether the Zim was intended as a genuine attempt to make luxury more accessible or simply a clever facade to remind regional leaders of their place in the hierarchy. It wasn't the General Secretary's car. No, that honor belonged to ZIS models. But it was certainly not something a factory worker would ever dream of owning. It was luxury through rationing. You could have a limousine, but only a particular one. And only if the party agreed you were worthy. Like being invited to an exclusive restaurant but told you can only order the soup. One quirky tidbit? A surprising number of Zims found their way into use as wedding cars. Couples, standing nervous and stiff in their pressed clothes, would step from the massive doors into photographs that made them look like miniature dignitaries. Rain spattered lace, or umbrellas clashed, and yet in that one moment, the couple could pretend they were as important as any regional committee secretary. Even today, a few Zims show up in vintage wedding fleets across Russia, their long bodies creaking but their aura intact. The rain, though, it always returns in your imagination. Soviet limousines were not built with the same obsessive ceiling as American Cadillacs or Packards. Leaks happened. You can picture the little drip forming along the edge of the windowsill, darkening the edge of someone's important-looking papers. The smell of damp wool coats and cheap cologne hangs in the air. Yet, somehow, this imperfection only adds to the theater. A limousine gliding through rain suggests perseverance. Inevitability. The weather is no obstacle to power. You imagine yourself seated inside as the chauffeur navigates puddles that gleam like mercury. Outside, pedestrians hunch against the storm. But you glide past, cocooned in a bubble of chrome and authority. The tires hiss through the water. The windshield wipers beat their mechanical rhythm. And your mind drifts, half in admiration, half in sleepiness, toward the strange paradox of these cars. They were simultaneously symbols of grandeur and reminders of limitation. And in that thought, you feel the weight of the Zim itself. Heavy in steel and heavy in meaning. It is not just a car. It is an instruction. Sit still. Look important. Endure the rain. You find yourself beneath the dripping spires of the Kremlin on a gray May morning. Red Square spreads wide before you, slick with rain, its cobblestones reflecting the faint shimmer of parade lights. The air is heavy with damp banners, limp against their poles. You hear the distant clatter of tank tracks echoing off wet stone. But your eyes follow the real stars of the morning, the Soviet limousines. They move not like cars at all but like floating stages, rolling slowly, almost painfully, at a pace so measured that a determined pedestrian could have overtaken them without breaking stride. Every second of that crawl matters. You sense it isn't transportation. It's choreography. The leader inside must appear unshaken, timeless, and invulnerable to the drizzle tapping against bulletproof glass. The limo itself becomes a metronome of authority, setting the rhythm of the parade. Your gaze shifts to the officers on the street, rain darkening their uniforms, boots splashing as they hold rigid salute after rigid salute. They wait as each limousine glides past, headlights gleaming like cold eyes. The parade is a storm within a storm. Steel beasts growl, soldiers march in mechanical unison. And somewhere amid this orchestrated chaos, the limousine's deliberate crawl reassures the watching crowd that order, not weather, rules the day. You notice the absurdity too. The speed is so slow that the engines seem restless, straining against restraint. A chauffeur's gloved hand grips the wheel with care, every twitch calibrated, for this is not the place for jolts or awkward stops. Even the windshield wipers beat in ceremonial rhythm. Swish swish, as though they, too, are saluting. The driver wears the kind of poker face learned from years of ferrying officials who never look him in the eye. Then your attention drifts back to the crowds lining the square. Umbrellas bloom like mushrooms in the drizzle, though many are absent, leaving men and women drenched but uncomplaining. After all, this is ritual. And ritual requires endurance. A murmur passes through them as each limousine passes, the wet stone amplifying the sound into a hushed, echoing reverence. The rain makes the cars glisten unnaturally, their chrome sharp as polished blades, their dark paint swallowing the grayness around them. From the rooftop cameras, from the journalists forced to squint through fogging lenses, the image is perfect. A powerful state, unbothered by weather, displaying its precision even at a crawl. The fact that half the audience is shivering, dripping, or wishing for warmth is irrelevant. The limousine's pace dictates how long they wait, how long they clap, how long they stand exposed to the elements. Rain doesn't stop a parade. It just makes the symbolism heavier. You begin to see the limousines as metronomes of ideology. They define time. They define patience. They define obedience. They roll forward as tanks thunder, as banners sag, as trumpets blare through waterlogged valves. And yet they remain smooth, steady, unswerving, and always, at the heart of this deliberate crawl, a leader sits beneath dry glass, unmoved, elevated above the weather, above the waiting masses. The irony is quiet but sharp. For all their grandeur, these limousines exist not to go fast but to prove that the state itself can slow the world down, can stretch seconds into significance. And so they crawl, endlessly, proudly, like heavy shadows drifting across wet stone. You lean closer now, away from the shining parades and into the quieter corners where the spectacle depends on those who are rarely noticed. Behind every gleaming limousine is a man in a raincoat, collar turned up, hat dripping steadily, standing guard by a service door. He waits with the patience of stone, eyes darting only when the drizzle rolls into rivulets down his cheeks. His purpose is simple: be seen by no one, prevent anyone from being seen who should not. Then your gaze drifts toward the chauffeurs. They are the hidden lifeblood of the procession. Inside the cocoon of the limousine, their shoulders are tense, though their faces never betray it. A chauffeur's world is reduced to the quiet rhythm of wipers, the smell of leather, and the immense weight of responsibility pressing down heavier than rain. Their uniforms may be crisp, but their job is to disappear, to embody silence on wheels. You imagine the training, hours upon hours of practicing slow crawls in empty lots, repeating turns so smooth that no glass of water on the dashboard should ever spill. Rain only complicates everything. Slippery cobblestones demand steady feet and steadier tires. The chauffeur's gloved hand must remain unshaken, steering a vehicle so long and heavy that a wrong twitch could send it lurching. And all the while, eyes watch, not just the secret police in nearby cars, but the officials inside, the party leaders who expect flawless execution. A cough, a stall, even a minor miscalculation could be a career-ending humiliation. But the chauffeurs are not alone. Around them, attendants in thick raincoats scurry discreetly, polishing away droplets whenever the limousines pause, ensuring the paint reflects banners and floodlights instead of water stains. Their hands are raw from constant wiping, their boots waterlogged from puddles. They do not march, they do not salute, but without them, the illusion of perfection would collapse. Every so often, your eye catches the absurd. One chauffeur quietly rolling down his window to flick away condensation while maintaining an expression of unshakable composure. Another man in a raincoat darts forward to adjust a flag mounted on the hood that droops under the weight of water. The audience never notices. They see only power gliding smoothly forward, never the small human struggles that keep it afloat. It strikes you, as droplets patter endlessly, that rain exposes fragility. The parades and limousines are meant to look eternal, immovable, godlike, but water seeps into seams, leaks into shoes, fogs up glass. The chauffeurs know this truth. So do the men in raincoats. They are the ones who keep reality at bay long enough for ideology to pass as spectacle. In their silence, you sense a quiet dignity. The chauffeur grips the wheel with a steadiness born not of pride but of necessity. The raincoat guard, soaked to the skin, shifts his weight slightly but never abandons his post. They are not honored in speeches, nor remembered in photographs. Yet without them, the great display of power would falter. Wipers would skip, engines would cough, and the illusion would shatter into puddles. And so, the limousines glide, the chauffeurs endure, the raincoats drip. Together, they form the invisible scaffolding that keeps the parade upright in the storm. Your eyes lower now, drifting from the banners, the faces, the waving flags, down to the ground itself. The rain has transformed the asphalt into a black mirror, catching light in streaks and broken shapes. Street lamps bend into long vertical smears across the puddles, and the wheels of the limousines carve trails of silver arcs with every turn. For a moment, the road seems more alive than the parade above it, rippling and shimmering like a restless river. The soldiers' boots slap against the wet pavement with sharp, deliberate rhythm. Each impact sends tiny bursts of water upward, droplets scattering and catching the glow of red banners overhead. The sound echoes strangely, boots striking puddles, tires hissing through shallow streams. The constant tapping of rain on stone and steel. Together, these noises form an accidental orchestra, as if the asphalt itself insists on being part of the performance. Shadows stretch across this stage, cast by the towering figures, the looming cars, the iron streetlights, but they do not fall still. Instead, they ripple and fracture with each shimmer of water, making the men who cast them look less certain, less solid. One moment a soldier's silhouette is rigid and imposing. The next, it bends and warps, looking frail, almost trembling. You realize that the rain, indifferent and unpolitical, is quietly rewriting the script of the spectacle. softening its sharp edges with reflections and distortions. At the edges of the road, drainage grates gurgle under the strain, swallowing the excess rain but never quickly enough. Small streams race along the curb, dragging cigarette butts, scraps of wet paper, and tiny fragments of gravel with them. Every parade, no matter how grand, leaves behind these unnoticed details. The debris of preparation swept into gutters, hidden from the narrative but etched into the asphalt. Now you notice the figures who occupy the margins. Police officers stand in shallow water, shifting their weight uneasily as puddles creep into their boots. Children press their noses against iron railings, their reflections quivering on the slick road below them. Old women, wrapped in scarves, shuffle carefully, wary of slipping on the stones. They do not look up at the banners. They look down, mindful of every step, grounded in the stubborn reality of wet asphalt. It is the shadows that linger in your mind most. They do not march in straight lines. They do not salute. They twist, bend, flicker, doubling and tripling on the surface of the wet road until it seems as if a ghostly second parade walks below the real one. The official procession is for the cameras, but the shadows belong to the rain and the street. They tell a quieter story, one of impermanence and fragility. The asphalt swallows each step, each wheel, each droplet, holding it for only a moment before erasing it in ripples. History will remember the parade as strong, orderly, eternal, but the road remembers only the weight of boots, the hiss of rubber tires, the water sliding across its cracked skin. And as you linger on this thought, you realize, the shadows and the wet pavement speak more truth than the banners ever could. The banners strain above you, their red fabric darkening under the steady downpour. At first they held their brightness like burning coals against the gray sky. But rain has a way of leaching color, softening edges, weighing down even the most defiant cloth. You watch as they sag slightly between the poles, droplets forming at their hems before falling in heavy intervals, splashing onto the parade below. Wind tugs at the soaked fabric, but instead of snapping crisply, the banners only shudder with a heavy, reluctant motion. Each gust turns their folds into sluggish waves, as though the cloth has grown weary of holding its message aloft. The slogans, once bold and commanding, now blur at the edges, the sharp letters bleeding faintly into the wet fibers. From a distance, they still look like declarations. Up close, they resemble watercolor paintings left out in the storm. Yet the symbolism remains stubborn. Red against gray, defiance against erosion. You imagine the intent behind them, the assurance that banners never falter, that they wave eternally above the crowd. But here, beneath the rain, you see their fragility. You see that they are just fabric, soaked, fraying at the seams, vulnerable to the smallest tear. People glance up now and then. Some admire, others ignore, but a few seem almost uneasy, as though aware of the contradiction. These symbols of permanence swaying under weather they cannot resist. Children point and laugh when droplets fall directly on officers' caps or onto the polished roof of a limousine. For those children, the banners are not eternal ideology. They are simply wet flags, heavy with water, dripping on everyone alike. The poles creak faintly, metal groaning under the combined weight of rain and cloth. Each banner, suspended in its moment of struggle, is half proclamation, half surrender. Their reflections ripple in the puddles below, twisting slogans into illegible shapes. Words meant to unify dissolve into abstract stains mirrored on the asphalt, where nobody bends to read them. In this scene, the banners feel less like instruments of order and more like reluctant participants in the weather. They are forced to endure the storm, neither triumphant nor defeated, simply soaked and sagging, waiting for the clouds to pass. You realize that even the strongest messages raised high and repeated endlessly, eventually sag under the weight of time and rain. Still, the red clings to its presence. Even blurred, even dripping, it does not vanish. The color remains stubborn, demanding attention, like a voice hoarse from shouting. The banners continue to speak, though in a tone more fragile, more human than intended. The rain, relentless and impartial, has found its way onto every face. You look around and see the crowd transformed into a collection of glistening masks, each expression altered by water. Drops run down foreheads, streak across cheeks, cling to lashes before falling. The human face, usually so defined, becomes blurred, features softened, moods harder to read. A stern jaw loses its edge when water drips persistently from the chin. Anger seems diluted when eyebrows are heavy with moisture. Even joy, when it dares appear, looks uncertain, as smiles twitch beneath trickling streams that sting the eyes and dampen the lips. You notice how people react differently. Some blink furiously, trying to clear their vision, unwilling to let the storm dictate how they see. Others close their eyes for long moments, surrendering, perhaps preferring the darkness to the distortion. A few wipe constantly at their faces with sleeves already soaked through. A futile ritual, an insistence on keeping order where none exists. Children fidget the most, they squint, tilt their heads, lick the drops from their lips as though the rain itself were curious flavor. Their laughter sometimes erupts in sudden bursts, out of place yet strangely vital, echoing against the uniform shuffle of feet. Adults glare at them briefly, but even in those glances the authority is softened, watered down like the ink of the banners. The officers, their visors beaded with droplets, appear less imposing. Faces that were meant to project discipline are obscured by reflections. Tiny mirrors of the gray sky fractured across their glass. A man in uniform wipes his face with a stiff hand, the gesture awkward, almost vulnerable. The mask of command falters when rain insists on touching the skin beneath. Around you, the collective becomes a sea of wet humanity. The sameness intended by uniformity is interrupted not by rebellion, but by water. Every face is unique in its struggle. One grimacing, one enduring, one amused, one lost in resignation. The storm has individualized what the occasion sought to standardize. You watch a droplet cling to the nose of an elderly man until finally it falls, landing with a faint plop into the puddle at his feet. His face relaxes slightly afterward, as though a small burden has passed. There is something profoundly human in that tiny relief. The drenched faces around you carry more truth than the banners above. In the waterlogged expressions, tired, irritated, amused, you see the reality that cannot be polished or staged. The storm reveals what ceremony tries to hide. That beneath every posture, every uniform, every attempt at control, there is skin, and skin remembers the rain. The ground has become a mirror. Puddles spread across the cobblestones, wide and shallow, their surfaces broken only by raindrops falling in endless rhythm. You glance down, and the world above reappears, distorted, wavering, fragile. The banners ripple in the water's reflection, their slogans unreadable, their bold letters stretched into serpentine shapes. Authority looks less absolute when bent by a ripple. A hammer and sickle, so sharp in cloth and paint, trembles like a child's drawing when viewed through the puddle's eye. People's faces hover at your feet. You watch them walk by in duplicate. One solid figure above, one liquid echo below. The reflected crowd moves strangely. Elongated limbs stretching and collapsing with every step. Feet splash into their own images, breaking them apart, reforming them instantly. It is a dance no one acknowledges yet everyone performs. Children test the magic deliberately. They stomp, sending waves across their mirrored selves. laughing when their heads shake apart in watery distortion. Adults scold them quietly. Yet even those stern voices carry little force when their own faces shimmer like ghosts in the puddles. You notice an officer pause to adjust his cap, his reflection staring back at him from the water at his boots. For a moment, it seems he considers that second self, the one blurred, unstable, dissolving at the slightest touch. Then he steps forward, crushing the image under a heel, as if to deny that fragility. Still, the puddle reforms, waiting patiently for the next drop to rewrite him. The sky itself rests on the ground. The gray dome above has fallen into the water below, so that you walk suspended between twin heavens. One oppressive and endless, the other shallow, temporary, easily shattered. Yet sometimes the puddle feels more honest than the sky. At least it shows the rain as it truly falls. Each circle spreading, colliding, vanishing. You step carefully now, watching how your own reflection bends with every movement. Your face looks older in the puddle, eyes heavier, mouth less defined. Perhaps it is not just distortion. Perhaps the rain draws out truths the dry world conceals. You wonder how many others notice their altered selves beneath their feet. The ceremony continues above, rigid and scripted, but below, in the water's stage, there is improvisation. Every drop reshapes the story. Every ripple mocks permanence. The banners above declare certainty. The puddles below whisper uncertainty. And you, caught between them, cannot help but glance downward again and again, as though the truth lies not in the sky but in the ground. You lift your gaze from the puddles and the liquid versions of the world, only to find the banners themselves beginning to dissolve. Not literally, but in the way your eyes refuse to hold them steady. The red fabric hangs heavy with rain, sagging from the weight of water, each droplet pulling at the threads. The slogans once painted in bold black strokes now run faintly at the edges, the pigment leaking like ink from a tired fountain pen. Words that should command obedience look tired too, blurred into stains that resist being read. You squint, trying to hold the letters still. Some remain sharp. Work, sacrifice, glory. Others smear together, the R sliding into the K, the O dripping into the V. You wonder if anyone else sees what you do, or if they still imagine the words stand untouched. Eyes around you stay dutifully forward, lips sealed, as if sharpness exists for them alone. The blurred slogans carry a strange new message. What once declared strength now looks weary, uncertain, fragile in its dripping imperfection. Where once the banner promised clarity, now it only suggests shapes, half-formed and fading, as if the rain itself were tired of obedience and chose to unwrite the words. Wind lifts the cloth, tugging it sideways. The letters stretch, distort, fold upon themselves. A single word elongates into something unrecognizable, a shape rather than a command. For a moment, you think you see an entirely different language, one that speaks not of loyalty, but of entropy, of the inevitable sag of time against authority's neat geometry. The crowd does not react. Children might notice, but adults have trained themselves to see only what is meant to be seen. They nod at the banners as though the slogans still shine, as though the dripping ink has not erased half the meaning. Perhaps the blur is forbidden. You think, perhaps clarity is compulsory, even when the letters themselves refuse to cooperate. Your eyes keep drifting back, though. You imagine peeling the wet fabric down, running your fingers across the bleeding paint, watching the slogans dissolve completely into red stains. Would anyone notice if the words vanished? If only blank banners hung overhead? Or would the crowd continue nodding, repeating the commands they believe must be there? The rain continues. The blur deepens. What once was an order has become an echo. What once was certain has become suggestion. And somewhere within you, the question lingers. What happens when a command becomes unreadable, and only its shadow remains? The march does not end so much as it fades. Like music played too long on a broken gramophone. Feet that once struck pavement in thunderous unison now move with a sluggish irregularity. Boots splash in puddles, their rhythms no longer crisp but muted, softened by water and weariness. What was once a parade has become a slow shuffle, a current of bodies drifting forward not out of will, but out of habit, as if the momentum itself had forgotten its purpose. The brass band that had commanded the square earlier now drones in fragments. Horns wheezing like sick lungs. Drums skipping beats. Cymbals too damp to ring. The grand march has thinned into a hollow procession. And you hear, faintly, the private noises hidden beneath. The cough of a soldier. The sigh of a worker. The groan of a cartwheel carrying banners too soaked to unfurl. Even the colors betray fatigue. The reds of flags hang darker now, stained almost brown, while the gray of the buildings seems to have seeped into everything. The uniforms, the faces, the sky, the sharp contrasts that once divided people from stone, banner from cloud, have bled into one another. All edges softened. No one announces the end. No officer signals dismissal. Yet, one by one, bodies peel away from the current. A man steps aside to tie his shoe and does not return. A woman with a child turns down a side street. A boy carrying a wet banner lowers it and disappears behind a row of cars. There is no resistance, only attrition, like rain slowly eating chalk off stone. You remain standing, though the parade around you has thinned to scattered lines and half-hearted echoes. The slogans above you sag, unreadable. The brass dwindles into silence. The puddles reflect only fragments now. A boot, a wheel, a corner of banner dissolving in ripple. At last, even the sound of feet fades. The street is no longer a stage, but only a street again, washed with rain, scattered with litter that once had meaning. Pamphlets soaked through. Streamers pulped into the gutters. The parade dissolves not with a shout, not with a collapse, but with the same slow certainty as the ink bleeding from the banners. And you, standing among the remnants, realize there is no true ending, only the gradual surrender of noise to silence, of order to blur, of movement to stillness. You take one more look at the street, at the puddles, at the faded flags, at the gray sky that presses down without ceremony. The story has not ended. It has only run out of marchers. And so, the parade is gone.